Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101, Morals in Society from Honolulu Community College. I am Chris Ann Moore. Tonight we're going to do program 25, Women's Rights. As we saw in the last episode, we talked about human rights, the idea that human rights, that human beings have fundamental, inalienable human rights, is supported really by natural law ethics, by Kantian ethics, by some utilitarian ethics, by most divine command theories even. And that human rights has become an essential ingredient in ethical theory in terms of both conceptualizing and actually succeeding in civil and social reform. Human rights has been at the center of the creation of democracies, at the fight against child labor, at the establishment of workers' rights, at the establishment of welfare, social security, disability benefits, of health and safety regulations. And human rights remain at the center of many of today's hottest ethical controversies. Abortion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, as we talked about last time, homosexuality, gay marriage, or civil marriage for homosexuals. And one of the reasons human rights are at the center is because human rights present such a sound argument for the existence of human rights, and yet leave us with questions about how to apply those human rights. There are still much controversy about what human rights actually are, what human rights exist, who do they apply to, who may be considered a human being with rights. Should rights be extended to animals in the environment? When there are competing rights, how do you resolve controversies between competing rights? At what point can rights be suspended or violated? After September 11th, many of the fundamental liberties given Americans by the Bill of Rights were suspended in the Patriot Act in order to help combat terrorism, but at the same time limiting civil liberties extremely. Is that all right? And how can human rights be enforced? Especially now that we see that the human rights, the fight for human rights, has really become a global fight. It is one of the greatest expressions of human rights. A human rights doctrine is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations, which is signed on by hundreds of member nations. But how can these human rights be enforced? We're not going to have time to talk about that in this episode, but you should have read your chapter on human rights and be familiar with some of those ideas. What we're going to look at today is one of the most important contributions of human rights ethics, which is the establishment of women's rights. Of course, now we're going to talk about one half of humanity and the establishing of rights of that half of humanity. You see, all of the major ethical theorists that we've talked about through this course, Buddha, Lao Tzu, the Sophists, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and actually the ethical theorists, the major ethical theorists we're going to talk about in the next episode, Jean-Paul Sartre and Soren Kierkegaard, all have one thing in common. They're all men. I am a woman, and yet I could list on one hand the women that I've discussed in this 30 hours of ethics, or that I discuss in 20 chapters of your ethics textbook. Eleanor Roosevelt, Ayn Rand, Rosa Parks. It is not that over all this time there have not been women philosophers. As a matter of fact, there has been. For instance, Mary Ellen Waithe, in her several volume book, The History of Women Philosophers, lists, in the classical period, 16 women philosophers. In the period from 500 to 1600 AD, 17 women philosophers. And from 1600 to 1900, 30 women philosophers. As a matter of fact, the Encyclopedia of Ethics, which covers both Eastern and Western ethics, cites 30 women ethicists. But this is an introductory course, and as an introductory course, we're looking at those philosophers that have been most influential. And the philosophers that we have looked at have been extraordinarily influential. But just because they were the most influential does not necessarily mean they're the most correct or the most sound. That still remains to be seen. You see, the fact is the history of the West has been a history of rigid social hierarchies. And the predominant subordination within those hierarchies is the fundamental subordination of women to men. This, in fact, is the definition of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system of rigid social hierarchies in which the central subordination is the subjugation of women to men. Now, those who were able to contribute their voices to the formation of philosophical and religious doctrine were those who were able to receive an education and those whose voices could or would be heard. Now, over all that time, the vast majority of men were excluded from that circle as well. Men were also subject to interlocking forms of race and class oppression. Women were also subject to these interlocking forms of race and class oppression. However, in addition, all women were basically defined as inferior to men. And therefore, both the vast majority of men and all women were kept out of the circle of those voices that could be heard and become part of official doctrine. Now, although those voices have been excluded, it is really important that we look at the view of women in the ethical theories that we have covered, in these enormously influential ethical theories. We look at how these ethical theories eventually contributed to women obtaining rights and continue to contribute to that struggle because it's far from over. And then eventually we need to look at how women's voices have sought to transform or contribute to ethical theory once their voices indeed could be heard. So that is what we're going to do today. We're going to look back over that history and see how these ethical theorists viewed women and how these ethical theories dealt with women. Now, as we talked about in our episode on the beginning, although extremely controversial, there is a great deal of evidence that the earliest Neolithic communities were egalitarian. In other words, all women and all men were basically equal, and these communities were probably peaceful. Less controversial, and there's a great deal more evidence that these peaceful, egalitarian Neolithic communities were eventually conquered by patriarchal warrior tribes. Part of the evidence for this is that the Indo-European language and mythology has been spread from communities from Britain to India. Now, interestingly, Indo-European is one of two gendered language groups. In other words, languages in which nouns are as assigned gender, female or male. The other gendered language is the Semitic, which interestingly is spoken by another patriarchal warrior tribe, which, according to the Bible, conquered agricultural communities throughout Canaan. Now, I've said again and again in this class, the Western mind, Western thinking, has developed out of two fundamental pillars: Greek thought and Judeo-Christian thought. And these are both fundamentally patriarchal, linguistically and mythologically. And therefore, it isn't surprising that we're looking at a history of the subjugation of women. So, why don't we go back and look at some of the positions of the philosophers that we have covered in this course on women and see how that the patriarchy expressed itself through philosophy and religion and through ethics. Plato and Socrates. Now we know, of course, Socrates didn't write, and Plato's dialogues use Socrates as the main character. Now Plato and Socrates, interestingly, are somewhat contradictory in Plato's own views towards women. Now, this may not be terribly surprising because actually Athens of the 5th century, although certainly patriarchal, still had some power and authority given to women. Now, this may be a remnant of those earlier egalitarian Neolithic communities where women had equal power. In fact, in Athens of the 5th century, both gods and goddesses are worshipped at the Athenian temples. Pythagoras, whose school we know, or believe at least, that Plato studied at during his 12-year travel, was taught by a woman priestess of Delphi, Themistoclea. And actually, even in the 5th century, both men, rulers, and ordinary citizens often order their lives dependent on the prophecy of the priestesses at Delphi. Although by this time the priestesses are under control of priests there who now have the authority to interpret their prophecies. And in the Symposium, Socrates says his teacher was a woman, Diotima, who was a priestess of Mantina. So we have this remnant of female authority in 5th century Athens, although we have a very decidedly patriarchal community. So perhaps it's not surprising that Plato's ideas are somewhat contradictory. In his earlier work, The Republic, he accords women a great deal of power, actually. He says that women can be philosopher kings, that women should be able to be educated equally with men, and should they have the desire and are able to pass the test, that women too can be rulers. They can be philosopher kings. As a matter of fact, Plato writes, innate qualities have been distributed equally between the sexes, and women can join in every occupation just as much as men. But then adds, although they are the weaker sex in all respects. So we have a pull there. Now, in Plato's later work, the Timaeus and the Laws, women don't fare so well. In the Timaeus, Plato actually suggests that all rational souls were first put into male bodies. And those men who were able to use their rationality to control their passions eventually would ascend to the stars. But those men who were unable to control their passions, who were irrational, would be turned into women. And that is how women got damaged, irrational souls. In the Laws, Plato actually says that a soldier who turns coward, the just punishment would be to turn him into a woman. So ultimately, although there is some power and authority and opportunity given in Plato's earlier works, by the later works, the Timaeus and the Laws, we clearly see that Plato associates men. Let's look at this on the slide. Plato associates Plato associates women with emotion, cowardice, unrestrained desire, and earthly entrapment, and associates men with reason, courage, temperance, and transcendence. And actually, the association of these characteristics, those with women and those with men, will really be repeated again and again in Western history, mythology, symbology, literature, and art. So let's look at Aristotle. Aristotle is not Athenian, he's Macedonian, and unlike Plato, his view of women is unmixed. Aristotle announces women are mutilated men. You see, for Aristotle, as we said, all things aim for the good. Therefore, the good must be that which all things aim for. And of course, the good for human beings is rationality. And men, of course, are more rational and stronger than women. So all of nature aims really to produce the male. But every once in a while, a deformity occurs. And due to this deformity, a woman is produced in the womb. Now, Aristotle does go on to say that this deformity is necessary for procreation, but he's quite clear that women are deformed men, less rational. As a matter of fact, Aristotle writes, the female, as it were, is a mutilated male. Women are more compassionate than men, more easily moved to tears, but at the same time they're more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and to strike, more void of shame, more false of speech, more deceptive, and more retentive memory, strangely enough. So that should be clear on Aristotle's opinion. Next, let's look at the Judeo-Christian ethic. Now, as I talked about today, Judeo-Christian ethics transformed rational Greek ethics. They expanded the ethic of the Greeks, which was self-realization and self-fulfillment through no harm and justice, to the idea of a transcendent ethic, which involves faith, hope, and especially, as we've discussed, charity and forgiveness. And as such, members of the Jewish and Christian religions have been at the center of social and civil reform movements. As a matter of fact, Charlene Spretnik writes that by the mid-'80s, even so decidedly secular a journal as The Nation published an estimate that 3/5 of the people engaged in substantial social change work in our country are religiously motivated. So, members of both the Jewish and Christian faiths have made enormous contributions to social justice, and they have created massive charitable organizations that have done a tremendous amount of good. However, it also must be realized that fundamentally at the center of the history of both of these traditions has been the subjugation of women to men. A history, actually, that many within those faiths, many Jewish people and many Christian people, are trying to redress and change. In order to understand that, though, we have to look at the basis of these traditions. We see, as Gerda Lerner writes, biblical core texts sat like a huge boulder across the paths women had to travel in order to define themselves as the equals of men. Because it was interpretations of the Bible that were used to subjugate women, to prevent women from being educated, from women from thinking or speaking publicly. So let's begin and look at the Jewish tradition, the Old Testament, which is the foundation for the later Christian and then Islamic traditions. The Orthodox Jewish morning prayer for men begins, "Thank God I was not born a woman." Now, if we look at the position of women in the Old Testament, this prayer becomes understandable. There's actually two stories of creation in the Bible. In one story, men and women are created at the same time. Adam and Eve are created at the same time. In the other story, Adam is created first, and then Eve is created later from his rib. This story has been used to say that women is secondary, that woman is subject to man, over and over again. Indeed, in Genesis also, we have the story of the ejection from the Garden of Eden, the fall. And the fall in that story is blamed on Eve. Eve becomes the source for which will later become original sin. In Genesis as well, we find what is interpreted as a commandment, which is, "The woman's husband shall rule over her." So we find in this Old Testament tradition that it is divinely ordained, as some would say, that women be subject to their husbands and fathers, that they're weak and temptresses responsible for original sin. Actually, again and again, in the laws of the Old Testament, women are treated as property. If a woman is raped, her father must be paid, and the rapist must take her to be one of his wives. If a woman is married and found and accused of not being a virgin, if she is found innocent, the accuser has to pay her father, and she has to go back and be her accuser's wife. This is just a couple of the examples. There are many of them. So as we look at the Old Testament, we find women really treated as property of their husbands and fathers. We find women's subjugation to her husband is divinely ordained. We have women causing the fall. We have women being created second. And we have many, many laws prescribing women's sexuality, women's menstruation. Now, there are those who argue that these laws in the Old Testament are actually an improvement over earlier pagan societies, but there's not a lot of proof of that. And as I said, there is some idea, there is some evidence that these earlier pagan societies were egalitarian. So that claim is definitely questionable. Now let's move into the Christian tradition. Now, Jesus was raised in this Jewish tradition. So it is actually kind of surprising that he treats women with a great deal of respect in the Gospels. Jesus shocks the other apostles by speaking openly with women. He accepts women among his companions. He breaks tradition to prevent a woman from being stoned. He heals a woman of her bleeding disease. As a matter of fact, when Jesus is crucified, it is women who accompany him to the crucifixion and witness his death. Mary Magdalene, a woman, is the one who first sees him when he rises from the dead. And it is Mary Magdalene who he tells that he is going to ascend into heaven. So we find in the Gospels a real respect and awe and equality, some might argue, given to women. This tradition, however, is not followed through in the development of Christianity. Although there is a lot of evidence that women in the early Christian churches, what we were calling the Jesus movement in our historical episode, and then the early Christian churches, that women did have some authority and power. We can find examples of this in the New Testament. For example, in Acts 9:36, Dorcas, a woman, is mentioned as a disciple. In Romans 6:17, Paul salutes Junia and states that she was of note among the apostles. Priscilla is mentioned as working with Paul and actually is mentioned as teaching the way to another preacher, Apollos. Again and again throughout the New Testament, early Christian meetings are held at women's houses. Chloe, Lydia, Nympha are just a few of those names that are mentioned. And Acts 2:17 says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. And so in Acts, we find women specifically referred to as well as men as prophets. Now, still, those verses in the New Testament that give power and authority to women, or can be interpreted at least as giving power and authority to women, are few. But the fact is, actually, in other Christian churches, in those gospels and parables and stories that did not make it into the Bible, there is far more evidence that women had power and authority in the early Christian churches. As I told you in the beginning, there were many different Christianities. There were many different Bibles. Gospels. Very important difference. Many different stories, parables, and gospels. In 1945, in Egypt, actually, 53 of these gospels were found. They've been called the Gnostic Gospels, those Gospels that were excluded in the creation of the Bible. And actually, in these Gospels, as author Elaine Pagels, who wrote the book, The Gnostic Gospels, there's a tremendous amount of evidence for women's power and authority in the other early Christian churches. Women performed the sacraments, women preached, women were equal with men in these early meetings. It is even true that Mary Magdalene is revealed as a powerful church leader of the early Christian churches, and some of these early Christian churches even worshipped a divine force imaged as female, which makes them incredibly different from the Christianity that we know of. And actually, in these years of the early Christian churches, in the mid part of the Roman Empire, actually in Rome itself, women were gaining greater power and authority. Some women, aristocratic women, had access to education. They were performing as lawyers and politicians and business people to some extent. There was a movement towards greater power for women in those years in the Roman Empire. But any movement towards power for women in Rome or in the early Christian churches was soon ended once the Roman Empire fell and it was domination by the Catholic Church for the next 1,000 years, because those Christian churches that would grow into the Catholic Church firmly maintained, the doctrine of the subjugation of women. You see, when Constantine made that alliance with the early Christian churches, it was really with Paul's churches. The churches that Paul had established in the Roman world were really the most organized, and eventually became the more populated and remained more organized. So when Constantine made an alliance with the Christian church, it was these Christian churches that he made an alliance with, what would become known as the legitimate or orthodox Christianity. Now, over the few hundred years, as the theology and doctrine, and eventually the Bible of this Orthodox Christianity was formed, what would be incorporated into that doctrine really would be a subjugation of women. The church fathers, the early church fathers, became extremely concerned with eliminating the heresies, the other Christianities in which women did have power and authority. And the attitude of the early Christian fathers was really a rejection and subjugation of women, and a rejection really and subjugation of sexuality, actually, which was associated with women. And to really understand some of these attitudes of the Christian fathers who developed the theology and doctrine of what would become the Catholic Church, the best thing I can do is probably read you a few quotes from the early Christian, the patrists, the fathers. Origen, who castrated himself, wrote, "God does not stoop to look upon what is feminine." Tertullian, another church father, wrote, "And do you not know that you are an Eve? The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are a devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die." Thus Tertullian blames women for not only the expulsion from the garden, but for the crucifixion of Jesus. St. Augustine writes, even before her sin, women had been made to be ruled by her husband and to be submissive and subject to him. St. Ambrose, Adam was deceived by Eve, not Eve by Adam. It is right that he whom that woman induced to sin should assume the role of guide, lest he fall again through feminine instability. And finally, Clement, every woman should be filled with shame by the thought that she is a woman. This attitude that we find in these quotes, and although these are quotes taken out of context for sure from various patrists, became doctrine in the Catholic Church. The subjugation of women within the Catholic Church was actually solidified in 324 when Eusebius, at the request of Constantine, put together the Christian Bible. As we talked about before, there was no Bible until 324. Eusebius, working or developing on earlier work done by Origen, actually decided upon which of those Gospels, which of those letters, which of those books would be included in an official Bible. And Eusebius's Bible is very much like that Bible that is still used today. It was slightly changed in 367, just about 25 years later, when Athanasius added 4 more books, which Eusebius had called disputed. And actually, Athanasius' Bible is the Bible that is still used. Now, in the Bible developed by Eusebius and Athanasius off of Origen's work, women are very clearly to be subjugated to men, especially in some of those writings in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul. I'll read you just a couple of those. In 1 Timothy 2:11, Let women learn in silence and with all submissiveness. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over men. Ephesians 5:22, women are instructed to submit to their husbands. And 1 Corinthians 14:33-35. As in all the congregation of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. And 1 Corinthians 7:1. It is a good thing for a man to have nothing to do with a woman. Now, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that then dominated the Western world after the fall of Rome for 1,000 years adopted this doctrine of women to be subjugated to men, to be submissive to her husband, to be silent within the church, as the originator of original sin, as a temptress. And this idea of women actually was retained in the psyche, consciousness, and even the civil and social laws of the West for the remainder of that time. Now, as we've talked about, 1500, after that 1,000-year domination of the church in 1500, the Protestant Reformation happened. At the lead of Martin Luther, the Protestant churches broke away from the monolithic domination of the church to establish Christian churches independent of Rome. However, unfortunately, women did no better under the Protestant Reformation. As a matter of fact, it may be argued that they did worse, because actually Martin Luther outlawed the veneration of Mary. Now, the veneration of Mary, which was not doctrine in the Catholic Church, had flourished under the Catholic Church, but it was now eliminated. Therefore, the only female image that's associated with the divine has been eliminated entirely by the Protestants under Luther's direction. But we can learn a lot by hearing what Luther has to say himself about women. This is Martin Luther in The Bondage of Will, 1527. God created Adam, master and lord of living creatures, but Eve spoilt all, when she persuaded him to set himself above God's will. 'Tis you, women, with your tricks and artifices that lead men into error. This is Martin Luther in Works. Even though they grow weary and wear themselves out with childbearing, it does not matter. Let them go on bearing children till they die. That is what they're there for. And again in Works, the word and works of God is quite clear that women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. Martin Luther. And so the subjugation of women in the doctrine of the Catholic Church, as interpreted through biblical texts, was adopted and propounded in the churches, the Christian churches that then became Protestant. They were fighting each other, but they had this in common. Now, there are many men and women from within the churches as well as from outside of the churches who have tried to counteract this tradition and actually to argue against the biblical basis for the subjugation of women. They have pointed, for instance, to texts in the Bible that do indicate women's spirituality and authority. For instance, the Song of Deborah. And there are some other places. And women throughout history have offered up alternative interpretations of biblical texts. For example, the doctrine of the creation, that women are subject to men, are inferior to men because they are made second. Actually, Jane Anger in the 16th century and women since then have argued that actually in the Old Testament, creation proceeds from the lowest to the highest. Therefore, what is made last is highest. Woman is made last. She is actually higher than man. Christine de Pizan in the 16th century will argue that actually man is made from dirt, woman is made from flesh. Woman is of a higher spiritual nature. There have been those who have reinterpreted the fall, the accusation that women are responsible for original sin. In a more metaphorical and intellectual analysis, people have put forth the fact that, of course, women are associated with the fall into matter. The spirit, the soul, becomes matter in the woman's womb. And therefore, of course, this fall from a spiritual state to an earthly state happens through women, which is the gateway to birth. And there are others also who have proposed alternative interpretations of some of the New Testament verses that I mentioned of Paul. As far as women being silent in church, there are women who have proposed that actually this verse can only be understood in its historical context, not to be stretched over all time. These women claim that actually what Paul was talking to was the women in church who were uneducated by the dictate of the time, and therefore they were talking away in church. And therefore Paul was referring to those women, asking them that they be silent in church and not interrupt. And if they wanted to know something, to ask their husbands afterwards. And there has even been an alternative interpretation of the Genesis doctrine that women shall submit to their husbands. Sarah Grimke in the 17th century suggested that this was not a command given to Adam. It was instead actually a prediction of the future given to Eve. This is what's going to happen, not this is what should happen, which is quite a different way of looking at it. And actually, probably one of the strongest counter-arguments to the biblical doctrine of the subjugation of women is against Paul's verses that are interpreted that way in the New Testament. It's pretty much agreed among biblical scholars that those verses in Timothy were not written by Paul. As a matter of fact, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that most of the verses that are attributed to Paul that demand the subjugation and submission of women were added later by post-apostolic writers that were looking for biblical authority and therefore ascribed their writings to Paul. But regardless of these reinterpretations or these different versions of interpretations or these biblical analyses, the truth is that the domination, the Judeo-Christian tradition has been a tradition of the subjugation of women to men. And to a large extent, that still exists today to one degree or another. The Catholic Church still denies all spiritual authority to women. Women cannot be priests or bishops or cardinals or be a pope. Women cannot perform the sacraments, based by the claim that women were not apostles and other doctrines. Now, many Protestant churches have taken a different view, and women have been given more power and authority in some Protestant churches, but there still are many Protestant churches where that is not the case. As a matter of fact, you can find sayings like I did actually at www.bible.org, where David P. Wallace writes, at some length, by the way, that Priscilla never taught Apollos, which may be true. He also writes, I would see no problem with women instructing men in several areas in church ministry, such as Sunday school classes or church history, basic Bible facts with a minimal of interpretation, and the like. But when it comes to teaching the word to men in a manner that involves interpretation and or application exhortation, this seems to be a violation of the prohibition in 1 Timothy 2:12 that we discussed earlier. So still, Bible verses are being used to prevent women from preaching, speaking, performing the sacraments in some Protestant churches. Now, although at various times in various places, women were able to actually recover spiritual authority, and really extraordinary women's voices have been heard on occasion throughout this history, but only the truly extraordinary. And actually, when the philosophical tradition re-arises temporarily with Aquinas, and then again comes back full force in the 17th century, philosophical doctrine will once again be utilized to justify the subjugation of women to men. As I spoke about when we talked about Thomas Aquinas and the natural law theory, it is really amazing that after 700 years of the suppression of philosophy, and actually the loss of philosophy to the West, philosophy re-arrives in the West as Arabic translations of Aristotle. And this is extraordinarily important, that it was Aristotle rather than some more purely rationalistic Greek philosopher who was rediscovered, because Aristotle's method was dependent on reason and observation applied to nature. And the recovery of Aristotle specifically inspired the scientific investigation that will characterize the Western mind from then on. However, the fact that it was Aristotle has also had an impact, and far less positive impact, on women, because just as he adopted Aristotle's view of nature, Aquinas adopts Aristotle's view of women. As a matter of fact, Aristotle had said women are mutilated men. The Judeo-Christian tradition we just spoke about, women are inferior, responsible for original sin, and must submit to their fathers or husbands. Aquinas, women are deformed men. So Aquinas adopts Aristotle's doctrine and actually writes, women are misbegotten males. Aquinas further argues that women exist for procreation because men have a higher spiritual nature. It is proper that men rule over the naturally inferior. So now let us skip to the reintroduction of philosophy after the scientific revolution. Now let's move into the Age of Reason, into the Enlightenment, and let's see what the philosophers said there. Hume, our next philosopher. Hume thought women are inferior and less capable of controlling their sexual appetites. Now, this is kind of surprising. Now, if you'll remember, David Hume based his moral theory on the idea that morality arises from emotion, from sentiment. Although he believed that rationality was necessary to discriminate between emotions and to determine the utility, as he said, of some actions, the fact is it was his recognition that the Western philosophical tradition had ignored emotion, which is actually our true motivator, our true inspirer, especially in the ethical realm. So one would think, since emotions have been associated with women over this entire period, that you might think that women were capable of ethical reasoning. But no, actually Hume writes, and I quote, "As nature has given man both the superiority of mind and body, it is his part to alleviate that superiority as much as possible by the generosity of his behavior and by a studied deference and compliance for all her inclinations and opinions." In his essay on chastity and sexual temptation, Hume writes, "All human creatures, especially of the female sex, are apt to overlook remote motives in favor of any present temptation." Now, Hume was, by all accounts, very popular with the ladies, especially in France, in Paris, where he and Benjamin Franklin had quite a high time. One can't help but wonder if the ladies had read Hume and realized that his deference was artifice, and that he really thought they were easy sexual targets. Now, Kant, let's look at Immanuel Kant. Kant believed women's role is to ennoble men, and therefore women's husband is her curator. Now, this may seem very surprising, actually, because Kant's entire moral theory is basically based on the argument that morality is an a priori idea present in all rational human beings. As a matter of fact, Kant was struggling to establish a universal moral theory based on the structuring of human consciousness present in all human beings. So one would expect that Kant would argue that women were equally capable of rationality, but he does not. He says they are inferior. Although he is a little contradictory on this point, the only point that he's absolutely sure of, that women are naturally more timid and fearful than men, he writes, and this is based on their natural role in procreation. But one would think, if women are capable of rationality, then they should be autonomous moral agents, as his own argument would suggest. But interestingly enough, Kant believes this would interfere with women's role. See, Kant believes that it is women's role to inspire men to be their best selves. And if they were educated to use their natural rationality, that would interfere with their ability to perform that role. He actually writes, rational capacities do not well befit her. And even if a woman should greatly succeed in them, destroy the merits that are proper to her sex. At the same time, they will weaken the charms with which she exercises her great power over men. You see, what he's saying here is women will be less attractive if they're rational. They will be less charming if they're rational. And therefore, women should not be educated to be rational. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say that a woman's education is not instruction but guidance. She must know men rather than books. In other words, a woman is to be educated to influence men with her charms and her wiles and her beauty. Her rationality would only interfere with this job. Kant also writes, a woman is little embarrassed that she does not possess certain high insights, that she is timid, that she is not fit for serious employments, and so forth. She is beautiful and captivates, and that is enough. You see, ultimately in Kant, women are not inferior by nature. They are inferior by education. They are not to be educated to be rational, and therefore they are incapable of involvement in politics. And because they are incapable due to education, the woman's husband, it must be her curator. See, a curator runs a museum, correct? Curator takes care of the beautiful things, the art. And a woman is to be art, to be beautiful. The man is to be the curator. Interestingly, Kant's entire argument basically reduces women to be used simply as a means for male self-realization. And therefore, Kant is utterly immoral by his own theory. Interesting contradiction. Now, after we studied Kant, we moved on to Bentham's utilitarianism. And as you recall, Bentham doesn't believe in natural rights. He called them nonsense upon stilts. But Bentham does believe in utility. As a matter of fact, he's a passionate social reformer, formulating his doctrine to encourage social reform, and argues vehemently that those rights that bring utility should be granted. And actually, Bentham argues for women's right to vote. We are now in the 19th century, and for the first time we will hear a male voice standing up for the rights of women. Bentham, on the other hand, argues, however, that women still must be submissive to their husbands. There is no utility in having a woman have power within the marriage. In this sense, Bentham argues what we saw from our next philosopher in our next chapter. After utilitarianism, we talked about human rights, and of course, human rights were grounded in the work of John Locke. Now, John Locke's ideas were revolutionary, literally. And some of his ideas about women were literally revolutionary as well. But he ultimately was not able to transcend his cultural context. Because, amazingly, John Locke is arguing that there is such a thing as natural rights. And that these rights do not include sovereignty of one human being over the other. He is contradicting the divine right of kings. But he also contradicts the assumption that men have any natural rights over women. He even contradicts the Bible interpretation in this regard. He actually uses the argument that will be used again by Sarah Grimke later that I already gave you. In terms of the Genesis commandment, or interpreted as a commandment, of woman's subjugation to her husband, women shall submit to her husband, Locke writes, God in this text gives not that I see any authority to Adam over Eve, or to men over their wives, but only foretells what should be a woman's lot. Again, here we see women submitting to their husband is not a commandment given by God to Adam. It is a prediction of what's actually going to happen to women, given by God to Eve. Interesting that Locke should put that forward. However, Locke goes on to say there is a foundation in nature for women's subjugation, and he bases this on their lack of strength and their lesser rationality. You see, in Locke's vision, all human beings in the state of nature were free, had liberty to pursue their own ends and goals. And he accords that freedom to women. And to Locke, as we talked about, all constrictions on the state of nature are due to a social contract that people enter into in order to improve their lives and create community. Well, Locke argues marriage is a social contract that women enter into freely, that women surrender their rights freely when they enter the marriage contract. Now, he goes so far as to say that women may negotiate a good contract. They may demand control of their own private property. Again, we see with the negative natural rights, you have to have the power to assert them for them to mean anything. However, once a woman enters into a marriage, she is to be subjugated to her husband. Why? Well, Locke says somebody's got to be in charge. As a matter of fact, he writes, it therefore being necessary that the rule should be placed somewhere, it naturally falls to the man's share as the abler and the stronger. He defends the power that every husband hath to order the things of private concernment in his family as the proprietor of the goods and lands there, and to have his will take place before that of his wife in all things of their common concernment. So ultimately, when we saw with Bentham, women should be given those rights which promote utility, including the right to vote. Locke, women must submit to their husbands in everything concerning common property. Now, as we saw, Locke was a huge influence on Jefferson. Jefferson, who wrote the American Declaration of Independence, demanded equality for all men. Well, one might think he was using man as it's often used, which is to refer to all. But he did not believe that women, as he wrote, had any place in politics. Jefferson, as many of the founding fathers of the United States, believed that women should be kept separate from politics. In fact, Jefferson said women should be educated to be good wives and mothers. Period. He did, however, think his own daughter should have a smattering of the sciences. He thought this because he was afraid his daughters would marry blockheads, as he said. He even went so far as to say there was a chance of 14-1 that they would indeed marry blockheads. But other than that, women should only be educated to be good wives and mothers. And actually, John Adams, whose wife Abigail had begged him, in a sense, to give women some rights in this creation of this new nation, wrote, "Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." Now, our next philosopher, John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian who advanced utilitarian arguments for liberty. Actually, with John Stuart Mill, we have our first philosopher who not only grants, but fights for women's free and equal rights. Mill demands full equality for women. Mill, along with his wife and collaborator, Harriet Taylor Mill, both wrote extensively on the accord of women the right to vote, the right to education, the right to property, the right to their children. And they both made these arguments on a utilitarian basis. And so we see in this entire history that we've covered so far, and we've had to run through in this episode really, that not until we move into the 19th century do we have equality for women even being discussed in the higher levels of philosophy. However, once the idea of human rights is put forward. It actually points a light on women's equality, and human rights is also the provides the basic, the philosophical basis for the fight for women's rights, which begins in the 19th century and actually is still going on today. And so read your chapter, read about the women's rights movement in the 19th century, and also read about feminist ethics that develop as women enter into academia and they have a voice, and what they're able to do with that voice once they have that voice. The ethical theories that are created by women, or the way that women have changed the traditional ethical theories, reanalyzed, and reformulated. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.